PTSD, that this is not feigned symptomatology. And then actually, if I look at the validity scores on the MMPI-2 that Dr. Curry administered, those scales are not elevated for exaggeration or malingering either. So if I add that, now I have really robust data that Ms. Hurd is not malingering or feigning her psychological symptomatology.
Thank you. Did you administer any tests that are specific to domestic violence?
Yes, I did.
Which ones?
So that was the conflict tactics scale, the abusive behavior observation checklist, and the danger assessment scale.
And what did they show?
Would like to refer to the testing.
To refresh
To
your
refresh
recollection?
my recollection, just a glance so
Yes,
I
you
can
may
be
do that.
clear with the jury. So what the overall gist of the testing was that, and the benefit of these tests is that they allow me to ask for what Mr. Depp did to Ms. Hurd and then also what Ms. Hurd did to Mr. Depp. So it was asking about both sets of behavior. And
Objection, Your Honor. We're back to reading.
She wasn't even looking down. She was looking at the jury.
I don't. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Please continue.
So what these tests show was that there was a high degree of serious violence perpetrated by Mr. Depp toward Ms. Hurd. There was violence more on the mild level perpetrated by Ms. Hurd toward Mr. Depp, with one severe indicator, which was the punching that she indicated to me. There were scales about negotiation, about how much this couple tries to figure out their problems. They both scored, again, this is Ms. Hurd reporting that, but they both scored in the high range where they're both saying that, yes, we're trying to figure this out, we're trying to work out this relationship. There were scores on the psychological aggression scale where Mr. Depp engaged in more severe acts of psychological aggression, whereas Ms. Hurd did engage in also some mild and severe acts of psychological aggression. The amount of injury that was reported was significantly higher and more severe by Ms. Hurd, what she was subjected to, and then she was subjected to sexual violence where Mr. Depp, based on her report, was subjected to none. And then on the danger assessment scale, that there were a number of factors that were related to severity in violent relationships and a risk factor. When we look, as I said earlier, when behaviors come up on this scale, they're very worrisome, very scary, and we have to take them seriously. So there were a number of behaviors that came up on this scale, such as Mr. Depp threatens to kill her, the increase in severity of the abuse, the forced sexual activity, the choking behavior, his obsessive jealousy.
Objection, foundation.
She's talking about the test results.
Overruled. Go ahead.
Please continue.
The obsessive jealousy, the control aspect, and his threatening of suicide to kill himself. So those were risk factors that placed her in the increased danger range. And this is a range that, says that we certainly have to advise women of their risk and consult with law enforcement if they're involved, or judges if they're involved, because this means that a woman is at risk for more serious or lethal domestic violence.
So did the results of the psychological tests you administered to Amber Heard support a diagnosis of PTSD?
Objection, leading.
What, if any, psychological tests did you administer that supported a diagnosis of PTSD for Amber Heard? Sure.
So there were 4 tests that supported that diagnosis. One was the PAI, which was that 344 question large scale personality inventory. On that test, her largest subscale, her highest subscale, was the one that measures traumatic stress. So that was clinically significant. On the TSI, 2 of her scales were the intrusive experiences dimension and the defensive avoidance dimension, two of the classic scales of trauma and PTSD. On the PCL, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist 5, that she scored in all 4 domains of PTSD, and that's an instrument that says how much are you bothered by these symptoms, and in all 4 clusters, which would be the intrusive experiencing, when things about the abuse or the trauma enter your mind when you did not want them to. Sometimes they're cued, sometimes they're uncued. She answered in the avoidance category, which is a second category of PTSD, that I do things to try not to think about this, to try not to feel this, to try not to get upset. Sometimes I avoid certain people because they become a trigger for me. She scored in the what we call the negative alterations in cognition and mood, changes in her thoughts and feelings as a result of the abuse and trauma, and also in the physiological hyperactivity, the hyperarousal, the hypervigilance, the startle response. So on the PCL, she endorsed symptoms in all 4 of those categories, saying, some of these symptoms are bothering me a lot. And then finally, the clinician-administered PTSD scale for the DSM-5. And what that allows me to do, unlike the PCL, is really look at symptom severity and symptom frequency. How is this really playing out for this individual? And similarly, she scored in all 4 categories of trauma and of having intrusive experiences and nightmares and avoidance efforts and physiological hyperactivity and changes in her mood and her thoughts. And her total score was a 28, which falls in the moderate range. So that means that she has experiencing a moderate degree of post-traumatic stress disorder symptomatology. And those tests allow me to make that definitive diagnosis that she suffers from PTSD.
Thank you. What, if any, consideration did you give to Amber Heard's history of childhood abuse in making your diagnosis?
I mean, that was a significant consideration, given that we know that childhood, well, first of all, we know that people can experience multiple traumas across the lifespan. And we wanted to make sure that the symptoms that she was experiencing were related to what she experienced with Mr. Depp and not her childhood. And certainly, earlier on in the evaluation and when I evaluated and spoke with her, that was true. And that was also true on the latest measure, the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5, the CAPS-5. And that's because the content, you have to look at what is the content of the symptom. So it's not that someone says, oh yeah, something traumatic comes into my mind. No, what is it? What comes into your mind? What bothers you? What are the triggers? And those were all specific to Ms. Heard's relationship with Mr. Depp. The reason the childhood is also significant is that we know that if somebody suffers childhood abuse as a child, they are much more likely to have an adult re-victimization. And they're much more likely then to be more vulnerable to obtaining a PTSD, to getting PTSD, if they've had that prior vulnerability. So it's a very strong vulnerability characteristic to obtaining PTSD when you have a subsequent trauma. The other aspect about her childhood abuse is that she was raised in a family of violence. She was physically abused by her father. She saw her father abuse her mother. Her father was very explosive and had violent outbursts. And both her parents also struggled with substance abuse very significantly. So she had learned from a very early age how to caretake, how to live in a situation that is mired in chaos. How do I take care of a parent who's passed out, knotted out from heroin? And how do I get up and get my sister to school? She learned at a very early age that she had to figure out how to do this in this scenario. And I would say lastly, what that environment taught her was that she learned that she could love someone who hurts her. She knew that people who hurt her also can love her. And she learned how to have this tolerance for cognitive inconsistency, this tolerance for two should be diametrically opposed emotions. But she grew up knowing or believing perhaps that this could happen. And she also believed that she could fix him, just like she tried to fix her father and just like she tried to fix her mother. She truly, truly believed that she could fix Mr. Depp and rid him of his substance abuse problems. But that did not work.
Did you review Dr. Curry's CAPS 5 that she administered to Amber Heard?
Yes, I did.
And what, if any, agreement did you have with Dr. Curry's interpretation of the CAPS 5?
I didn't agree with her interpretation, having been a trauma psychologist for over 25 years and administered hundreds of these. I found that there were flaws in how she chose to administer it, and then some of the coding. Ms. Heard on that CAPS 5 to Dr. Curry certainly reported trauma-based symptomatology related to the abuse by Mr. Depp, but somehow that was not coded as such.
And did you review Dr. Curry's MMPI 2 that she administered on Amber Heard?
Yes, I did.
And do you agree with her interpretations on that test?
No, I do not.
Why not?
Because this profile is a normal profile. There are no clinical scores elevated above 65, which is 1.5 standard deviations of the mean, which is what we use to determine clinical significance. And if none of those scales are elevated, it becomes very difficult for us to make assumptions about a person's psychology and their functioning. Now remember, the psychological testing generates hypotheses about a person that we then, using our clinical judgment, have to make a decision about. We have to make an assessment about it. And if none of those scales are elevated, it just doesn't give us rich information to make those determinations. The one scale which is accurate that was elevated was one that measures defensive responding, sort of a protective responding, an unwillingness to admit minor faults. That was elevated, and that was true. But the result of that is you have a defensive profile. You have somebody who's not giving you a lot of information. So the scales are all low. So there's no way you can take that MMPI and then say it meets it's consistent with borderline personality disorder. You just don't have the symptom expression on it in order to do that.
And that's my next question here. What, if any, diagnoses did you make of personality disorders for Amber Heard based on your testing?
I did not make a personality disorder of Ms. Heard.
Why not?
For a number of reasons. Number one, a personality disorder requires a pervasive pattern in a variety of contexts. 2 key words: pervasive pattern, variety of context. That means if her emotional instability, her affect dysregulation, or her fear of abandonment is only occurring in the relationship with Mr. Depp, and we don't have evidence of it before, and we don't have evidence of it after, it is not.
All right. Do you want to approach?